I think climate change is fundamental for Africa the way it currently isn't for Europe. So according to the UN, so global warming has been pretty hard in Africa. The latest reports show that extreme weather events are more prevalent on the continent, and the prognosis over the next few years don't look very good either. We are seeing cyclones after cyclone on the continent. We are seeing flooding, in the Sahel. We are seeing droughts, across different countries on the continent. And in a continent that depends heavily on rain-fed agriculture, that is a big problem. So we're having, famines, we're having droughts, we're having flooding. Sea levels are rising. Lakes and rivers on the continent, they've reached, I think last year, they reached the highest levels ever. So things are pretty bad. But to sort of add to that is the fact that Africa suffers from what the UN calls, describes as a sort of a conglomerate of issues around climate change, which makes Africa a lot more vulnerable than other parts of the world. And at the center of all of this is the fact that resources is a big problem. They're spending their resources way higher than any other part of the world in dealing with adaptation to the climate emergency. So the UN ECA data show, for example, that African countries are spending, some of them are spending about 10% of their GDP, not their budget, of their GDP, on adaptation measures. So this is a really difficult place to be in. And so for any country, but especially for countries that don't have a lot of resources in the first instance, this is a big problem. But even that 9 to 10% of GDP is not anywhere close to what is needed. Data from the AUC show, I think from between now and 2030, that Africa needs about 30 to 50 billion dollars to address adaptation measures alone. So this is a really difficult situation for any country to be in, and especially it is for countries that did not create the climate emergency. I think it should be central to it. I mean, I don't see enough of that, unfortunately, on the agenda. The EU has the EU Green Deal, which, as we all know, is an internal package for the EU, but it also has foreign policy dimensions. So what I would say, first of all, on this is that whatever the EU does must not harm Africa, must not harm the continent that did not create the climate emergency. That's a very basic first. But beyond that, I think the EU and should be able to work with African countries closer around the goals of the UNFCCC process, or the Paris Agreement process. But beyond all of that, I think there's a template from which Europe can work with African countries. This template is sort of right now the deal that was announced in Glasgow at COP26 between South Africa and the rich countries in the world, which include France, Germany, and the EU. The deal basically is a $8.5 billion deal that will support South Africa to transit from using coal to renewable energy sources. But for me, I don't think actually the issue is the money itself or the transiting itself. It's what it connotes, right? We have to understand, and I think the deal gets this sort of right, that transiting from one energy source to another isn't necessarily just a technical issue. It's about the jobs that are attached to the energy source you're transiting from. And we're talking about well-paid jobs in communities where coal is extracted and processed. So what happens when those jobs disappear, right? I mean, I think that's one of the issues that the deal is going to help address. And I think we can use this as a template for other kinds of, for other countries on the continent. The South Africa deal presents a good template that can then be used to see, okay, how do we create other kinds of deals in other parts of the continent that can support the countries around the things they've identified as priorities around the climate change issue, and that can also produce, create jobs, deal with issues around, agricultural resilience, deal with energy issues for areas on the continent where the issue isn't transition, but actually access, right? So for many parts of the continent, you're not talking about transiting from one thing to the other. You're talking about having access at all. Why are we not having, looking at creating this sort of deals in different parts of the continent that would produce such effects, right?